First-year student?
No, a lot of them are there. Hello and welcome to Focus on Women. As I indicated a couple of times in the last 2 weeks, we have a guest speaker this morning who is going to talk about Christian feminism to you, and you've all had the handouts for a long enough time that I hope you've all read them. This morning we have Dr. Joyce Kennedy with us. Dr. Kennedy is an English professor, and she is, many of you will know her as the Assistant Director for Continuing Education. A lot of the women in this class and in many of the Women's Studies class first come to the Mount through continuing education. Dr. Kennedy is also a student right now. For the past few years she's been studying at the Atlantic School of Theology, and this May she will graduate with a Master's of Divinity. She is currently offering a non-credit course at Mount St. Vincent, and I believe she'll be talking to you briefly about that might happen again in the future. It's on Christian feminism. It's offered this term on Thursday nights. Okay, thank you very much, Joyce, and take it away.
Good morning. I'm glad to be here with you. I'm surprised at the size of the class. I didn't realize it was this big. Today I'd like to speak to you in sort of 3 parts, which is the typical sermon. There's always 3 points. The first part is a rather informal introduction to the nature of the problem. And the problem is, can you be a Christian and a feminist? And some people say no, like Mary Daly, and some people say yes. But in staying a Christian, you have to relook at the Christian tradition, because if we look at it, we can see it's quite misogynist. The second part, if I have time, is a more formal presentation on feminist theology, an emerging kind of look at theology through the eyes of women. And the third part, again, is a sort of informal part, is what is happening in the churches today? Is there some kind of evolution taking place so that the freedom that is looked for in the women's movement can coexist with the Christianity that we have been brought up in, many of us? And also, not just Christianity, but the Jewish tradition also is re-examining itself. So I'm going to begin with a story in this book, Sexism and God Talk, which is, I think, a seminal work in feminist theology by Rosemary Ruther. And she begins her book with a little parable, and I'd like to begin with reading that parable. I am the Lord thy God. Thou shalt have no other gods before me, bellowed God the Father, as he seated himself high upon his cherubim throne, and surveyed the ranks of angels doing obeisance to him. Having expelled the quarrelsome sons of heaven who disputed his reign, he had finally restored order in the heavens. But earth was a different problem. Ever since the rebellious sons of heaven left to rape the daughters of humankind, things had been chaotic down there. From this violence, all sorts of monsters had been born. While all about him the ranks of angels sang his praises unceasingly, God the Father was frustrated with his inability to have his will done on earth. He was also getting somewhat bored with having his way so completely done in heaven. Something is missing here, he thought. As his mind wandered, images floated to his eyes. The shapes of the daughters of humankind appeared, but he sternly suppressed them. Oh, he thought, these are the cause of all our problems. If it had not been for their seductive form, the sons of heaven would not have rebelled and fallen to earth. The first one, Eve, disrupted my original plan for paradise. I had to show her what the real world means. Men ruling and women obeying. Bringing forth children in sorrow and living in subjugation to their husbands. This is the real world. Another image floated before his eyes. A shining figure clothed in a dark mantle embroidered with stars. The moon crowned her head, and she had fruits and flowers in her hands. My God, he half exclaimed, to the surprise of some of the angels who overheard him, the Queen of Heaven. Why does she still appear in my head? I crushed her rule a millennium ago. Can it be that somewhere outside my omniscience and the sharp eyes of my couriers who survey all parts of the kingdom, that she still reigns? I know all things, thought God the Father. No reality escapes my knowledge. My decree against idolatry forbids all my subjects in heaven and on earth from worshiping anybody but me. Even as these words formed in the Father's mind, the Queen of Heaven smiled and shook her head. No, Lord Sabaoth, my son. I am the mother of gods and humans, creatrix of all things. I am your mother too. Even when you deny me, I am still here. Beyond your knowledge, beyond your decrees, there is another one who is before you, who is greater than you, and who will survive the death of your reign in the heavens. Sabaoth was startled by these words. He felt a sharp pang of anxiety. He had not felt such guilt since he had defeated the Queen of Heaven and deposed her daughter Eve from power in the Garden of Paradise. He had walled off the pillars of the cosmos against the Queen so that she could never again be known or come to mind. Could it be that my own decree against idolatry is the greatest idolatry of all? Wondered. The angels that sing my praises, the kings of earth that bow down before me in their temples, cry that I am their only Lord and ask me for help in their battles. Perhaps I have become more their creature than their creator. I and the kings of earth have come to resemble each other too closely. By calling me Father, Lord, Ruler, they claim the power to rule the earth as I rule the heavens. Beneath their feet ranks of servants bow down, even as the angels bow before me. Men teach women their place on earth, following my example. Perhaps this hierarchy of earth and heaven is a facade, a delusion, concealing other realities that we dare not know. The rebelliousness I experience among my sons, the rebelliousness of the kings of earth, those which are experienced among their manservants, and worse still, their maidservants, point to another reality. Perhaps it is she, the Queen. Perhaps there is another power outside our rule that still eludes us. God the Father reflected, in other times, I have known other ways of being God. Put down the mighty from their thrones. Vindicate the oppressed. Release the captives from their prisons. Perhaps I must call to mind this way of being God. Extend to others, to slaves, to Gentiles, even to women. A bolt of lightning flashed across the sky, rending the closed fabric of the universe and opening a crack through which a beam of light began to pour. Like a shooting star, the light flew to earth. An echo arose from a comet like a whisper through the heavens, and being in the form of God, he did not count equality with God a thing to be prized, but emptying himself, he became a servant. At that time, a young woman betrothed to be married was discovered to be with child. Great scandal was raised, and her betrothed was about to put her aside. He was persuaded by an angelic visitation and consented to marry the woman, Mary, to cover the illegitimacy of her child. That's the end of the beginning parable in this book. Rosemary Ruther goes on to give us an analysis of the problem when the first commandment, I am the Lord your God, you shall have no other gods before me, is used as an idol to beat people into submission. This is a fundamental book. If you haven't read it, I think you should. I'll put it on the monitor again. Now, how bad was it? How bad has it been in Christendom? I'm sure you've heard quotations before from the early fathers of the church. I'm going to give you a couple from this book called Religion and Sexism. It's a book of essays edited by Rosemary Ruther. And I'm going to quote from two, from Clement of Alexandria. You might want to just note their names if you want to hunt these down. And from Tertullian, two of the early church fathers. This one is from St. Clement, saint, by the way. These are all saints. I find that very interesting. And this is from an essay on beards. And it's an essay showing that men's beards are a sign of their greatness over against women. It's kind of amusing. I thought you might enjoy it. Is it meant to be amusing? No, it isn't. But 2,000 years later, it is amusing. Clement says, this is a discourse on the manliness of beards. You don't have a beard. His beard, then, is the badge of a man and shows him unmistakably to be a man. Think of all the shops that remove facial hair from women. It's maybe they should read Clement. It is older than Eve and is the symbol of the stronger nature. By God's decree, hairiness is one of man's conspicuous qualities. And at that, hairiness distributed over his entire body. It's interesting. When we think of the macho figures, even today, what's that Hawaiian character? Magnum, yeah, Magnum P.I. I mean, it's picture Magnum without a hairy chest. It's a sign of his superiority and his manliness. Whatever smoothness or softness there was in him, God took it from him when he fashioned the delicate Eve from his side to be the receptacle of his seed. So women are sort of soft potting soil. His helpmate, both in procreation and the management of the home. What was left, remember now, he had lost all traces of hairlessness, was manhood, and reveals that manhood. His characteristic is action, hers passivity. For what is hairy is by nature drier and warmer than what is bare. Therefore the male is hairier and more warm-blooded than the female. The uncastrated than the castrated. We're the castrated.
So that's where it got it.
The mature than the immature. Guess who? Thus, it is a sacrilege to trifle with the symbol of manhood, the beard. This was discovered in the 1960s. Rediscovered. This is Tertullian. Tertullian was one of the classic African fathers in the early church in the 3rd century. He wrote reams and reams. If you want to go over to Atlantic School of Theology and look through the library, you can see whole bookshelves with Tertullian's writings on just about everything. This is him on women. Know one of you at all, best beloved sisters, from the time that she has first known the Lord and learned the truth about her own condition, would have desired too gladsome, not to say too ostentatious, a style of dress, but rather go about in humble garb, rather to affect meanness of appearance, walking about as Eve, mourning and repentant, in order that by every garb of penitence she might be more fully expiate what she derives from Eve. And he goes on, we're supposed to go around, I wore red on purpose, we're supposed to go around in dark clothing, hiding our faces. Islam has brought that back now in the Islamic countries, to hide the woman's face, her body, because that's what happened. Eve was too good looking. Actually, she walked around with no clothes on, so it was quite easy to see how good looking she was. And this is what happened to Adam. He was tempted by this woman's beauty to eat the apple. And Tertullian says, Do you know that each of you is an Eve? The sentence of God on the sex of yours lives in this age. The guilt must of necessity live too. You are the devil's gateway. You are the unsealer of the forbidden tree. You are the first deserters of the divine law. You are she who persuaded him whom the devil was not valiant enough to attack. You destroyed so easily God's image, man. On account of your desert, that is death, even the Son of God had to die. Now, the church has taught that for years. In subtle ways, women can't be ordained ministers. Only recently in the Anglican Church, still not in the Roman Catholic Church, and you ask any woman who is ministering in some of the other Reformed churches whether or not they are equally stationed. So there is the problem, and the problem is this history of misogyny in the Christian church. Let me give you a summary statement from Mary Daly's book, Beyond God the Father. Oh, by the way, maybe I should read to you a little section. This is from Vatican Council II documents, post-conciliar documents, and one of them is a document on why women cannot be admitted to the ministerial priesthood. The Catholic Church has never felt that priestly or episcopal ordination can be validly conferred on women. Now listen to this. A few heretical sects in the first century, especially Gnostic ones, entrusted the exercise of the priestly ministry to women. There were Christian groups who ordained women, but they're defined here as heretics. What's a heretic? Come on. What's a heretic?
Person who doesn't believe in God or blasphemes the church.
Well, the Gnostics believed in God. They celebrated the Eucharist, only they had women doing it. Not only did they believe in God, but they were strong believers in the Holy Spirit. The Gnostic communities, read Elaine Pagel's book on the Gnostic communities, the Gnostic Gospels. What's a heretic? When I was growing up, I was brought up as a Catholic. When I was growing up,
Person who speaks against God.
that's a blasphemer. I was looking at an old genealogy from the French shore in Nova Scotia, and it had lists of marriages and baptisms. And it would have things like so-and-so married so-and-so heretic. So-and-so married so-and-so pagan. And you know who pagan meant? Aboriginal people. If a Frenchman married, or a Frenchwoman married a native Canadian American Indian, the designation was pagan. And if a French Catholic married a Protestant, the designation was heretic. This is 1910, okay? My ancestors are DeVoe, so let's say Jean DeVoe married, Mary Smith, heretic. What's a heretic? Someone who doesn't believe the way you do. That's a heretic. Protestants, Reformers called Roman Catholics heretics. The great whore of Babylon, the Pope. All right? Well, I want you to think about that, because this says that, well, yes, we know there were people in the early centuries conferring ordination on women, but they were heretics. I.e., they didn't believe what the majority believed. Like circulation of the blood, like inoculation against smallpox. Every single thing you can go back in history and see, there were people who rejected those things until the majority became more enlightened. Newton wrote the Principia, and for 2 centuries, people were still following Descartes. They didn't believe Newton. How can there be action at a distance? How can this planet affect that planet unless there's a bunch of jelly in between communicating the vibrations to this other planet? Newton said, no, I don't know how it happens, but this planet affects that planet, and everything in the universe is affecting each other in this universal system. And they said, that's magic. We don't accept that. Descartes makes more sense. A whole bunch of wheels within wheels within wheels, each one moving the other one. That makes a lot more sense. Okay, I emphasize this because one of the things we're going to find in looking at a renewed interest in Christendom is that some of the women doing feminist theology are going back to other sources than the canon, than the four Gospels and the Acts. They're going back to look at all of the other literature that was being produced earlier on by Christian communities who were considered to be heretics, like the Gnostics. It's very interesting. I studied at AST, I studied the development of Christianity in the tradition of Christianity, and it's very interesting that all of the early movements that were labeled heretical and people were suppressed, or many of them, had women as leaders. That's a fact. And you don't know that if you don't begin to study other sources. So to get back to the Vatican document here on ordination of women. The Catholic Church has never felt that priestly or episcopal ordination can be validly conferred on women. A few heretical sects in the first century, especially the Gnostics, entrusted the exercise of priestly ministry to women. This innovation was immediately noted and condemned by the fathers. I bet it was. I'm wearing my button. Canadian Catholics for Women's Ordination. This is our sigla. I'm going to be the first one. It is true that in the writings of the fathers, now, you see, you can't get away from this. It is true that in the writings of the fathers one will find the undeniable influence of prejudices unfavorable to women. Here we are in the 20th century, we recognize that when we read Tertullian and Clement and Augustine, the major fathers in the early church, because they were living in a time when this was common thinking. We can't blame them. I don't blame them. Because they were living in a time when this was the common way of thinking. So they say, we know that this is true. Nevertheless, it should be noted that these prejudices had hardly any influence on their pastoral activities. Now, can you believe that? If you think that you and you and you and you are the devil's gateway, I'll give you an example of St. Jerome. He's a saint. St. Jerome had a bevy of women who followed him around, listening to his counsel. And part of his counsel was that women should fast, and he had a lot of women doing this, to the extent that they ceased to have their menstrual periods. If you're in countries where there's a kind of starvation, women cease to have menstrual periods, physiologically. You can starve yourself into that. Because that blood that came around every month was a sign of the woman's base nature. And so if she could become more like St. Jerome, who couldn't have menstrual periods, then she would be more perfect. And one line in the Christian tradition, which has nothing to do with Jesus, because Jesus did not go around fasting. He said, with the bridegroom is present, who can fast? The first miracle in St. John's Gospel, they're out of wine. Does he produce 2 bottles and say, well, you can each have a little bit? No. 7 water jars, each holding 30 gallons. I mean, you want a party? 210 gallons of wine. I mean, that's the first miracle described in St. John's Gospel. Why be stingy? Let them have a good time. You can celebrate for 2 weeks. But there is a strain in Christianity which is anti-woman, anti-body, anti-sex, anti-emotion, anti-feeling. It's not the fundamental, to me, it's not the fundamental Christianity which exists, but there is that strain, and we see it here in people like Jerome and people like the early fathers who wrote against women because they felt somehow that there was something dangerous about this chaotic, quivering, bloody, emotional bundle. And I'm sure that many women have grown up feeling that way themselves. When I was a kid many moons ago, we learned to talk about our monthly menstruation as the curse. The curse. What a way to think about giving birth. Of course, it isn't comfortable. And it hurts. And it's inconvenient, but I hate to think of it as the curse. Anyway, so that's the dimension of the problem. I could quote you 3 or 4, yards of that kind of material. And Mary Daly sums it up here. This is a book, Beyond God the Father. Any person, man or woman, who is serious about thinking new thoughts has to read this book. I think this book, in the realm of theology, in the realm of rethinking in the Judeo-Christian tradition, is equivalent to something like the Principia in science. It's a book, Mary Daly has written a lot of other books, but this book to me is a classic epiphany, like a breakthrough of picking away at all of our prejudices and all of our thinking. I don't agree with everything she says, by the way. I don't agree with her put down of men, because that's just another form of dominance. I don't agree with her idea that we have to go away to some little borderland and live as a sisterhood apart from the world, because that's just another way of not being part of the human race. But you have to read this book, I think, to get the dimensions of the problem posed by the way Christianity has evolved over 2 centuries, and to give us new eyes to think about what's happening. We don't want to stay with Descartes when Newton is the word, and I think we need to read Mary Daly, even where we disagree with her, and I do. When she was here at Dal, I went and listened to her. How many heard her at Dal a couple of years ago? Did anyone go and hear Mary Daly? No? Well, I saw men sitting in the audience sinking lower and lower into their seats. They began by laughing because she's very funny. But after a half an hour of attack and put down of the phallocracy and, everything to do with men and maleness and all that, you could visibly see the men sinking and sinking lower into their seats. And they weren't laughing anymore. It was like wife beating, only here it was men bashing. And I have a husband and 3 sons, so, I have to be committed. I'm outnumbered. But that's not to say that I've heard Mary Daly's name pronounced as if she is evil incarnate. She is not. She's a great seminal thinker. And if she shakes us up, that's what's needed. Men and women. Anyway, to quote, this is my plea for Mary Daly. To quote, this is from a chapter called Beyond Christolatry, A World Without Models. And it's the second coming of women and the Antichrist. We should also consider the possibility that the reversal phenomenon has taken place in assertions that Christianity has raised the status of women and affirmed our dignity. Because this is the argument that's made, like women were nothing. Christianity has raised them up, given them equal status, done away with circumcision, given baptism. And if you think about it, the first argument in the early church was, do the new Christians have to be subject to the law? Meaning, do they have to be circumcised? And Paul said no, and Peter said yes. You had the Jerusalem church arguing against the Gentile church at the first council of the church in Jerusalem, 1st century. And Paul won. They debated the issue, and Paul's party came out victorious. No circumcision. Baptism is sufficient. Well, that was the first thing to, how could you have had equality in Christ if circumcision was retained? Because in Jewish tradition, it was through the man that the woman was redeemed. The man was circumcised. All of his women became part of the covenant through the man. And the first act of the Christian church was to say, no, baptism in Christ is sufficient. So men and women could be equal. And so this whole evolution that women's dignity, but it's the pedestal. The pedestal is the pits. We don't want to be on the pedestal. We want to be who we are. And Mary Daly says that, well, women who have attempted to be feminist and at the same time Christians have generally gone along with this idea. Want to be a feminist, want to be a Christian, you say, look, Christianity has raised our status. Believing that Christianity did advance the cause of women in the past, but now it kind of lags behind. However, the record of barbarous cruelty to women in Christendom hardly gives unequivocal support to this kind of apologetic. If you look at the history of women in Christendom, it's hard to believe that their status has been raised by Christendom, says Mary Daly. Christian theology asserted widely that women were inferior, weak, depraved, and vicious. The logical consequences of this opinion were worked out in a brutal set of social arrangements that shortened and crushed the lives of women. And I'm sure you've all read about the witchcraft, the campaign against the witches of Europe. And even in New England in the 17th century, if you've read The Crucible, some of you have read that play by Arthur Miller about witchcraft in Salem. Maybe you've even been there and seen the hanging trees and so on. And the witchcraft episode was 2 or 3 men who were thought to be collaborating, but a whole bunch of women. Odd women. Women who lived alone. Spinsters. And the witchcraft thing in New England wasn't stopped until the governor's wife was accused of witchcraft. Then things had gone too far. When Governor Hutchinson's wife was accused, that was the end of the witchcraft trials. So Mary Daly refuses to accept the idea that it is because of Christianity that women's condition has been made better. I think she's a little bit too harsh myself on that. I think that women's lot has been made better over the course of centuries because of the teachings of Christianity. However, although women's dignity has been raised, and especially devotion to the Blessed Virgin Mary as the mother of Jesus, that devotion to Mary raised the status of women and of motherhood. It's still true that the status was raised by putting women on pedestals, by setting up for them an ideal that was impossible to realize, of goodness, sweetness, support, perfection, chastity. I mean, we're not like that. We're human. We get angry. We get tempted. Sometimes we want to throw our kids out the window. And so the good thing that Christianity did became a noose around women's necks in a way, because they couldn't live up to that ideal. Because all of the goodness of the earth was put upon them. Men wanted to look up to them. And you can't have equality in a situation where you're on a pedestal. You have to climb down off it and walk together on the same sand. and help each other out of the same traps.
So what are your comments on the parable that you read at the start off?
The God who lifts up the poor. That's what we're going to get to in the last part. Like, what was the gospel all about? And can you be a Christian and a feminist? Mary Daly says no. Beyond God the Father is her classic text to tell us why no. Naomi Goldenberg, Canadian Jewish woman, in a book called Changing of the Gods, she does for Judaic culture. If you are from a Jewish background, you should read Naomi Goldenberg's book, The Changing of the Gods. She's doing the same thing that Mary Daly does for Christendom. So they say no. But these other women that I'm going to talk about, Rosemary Ruther, Elizabeth Fiorenza, Dorothy Zola, a whole lot of other ones, Phyllis Tribble, Letty Russell, give big long list, say that's not true, that Christianity if it is lived the way it was intended, can move in and do away with the dominance model. Okay, to carry on in part one here, the problem, as we can see it, is that we have a corrupted understanding. And one of the things, and this, I'd like to just give you a little story from my own life, a class I'm taking in preaching. One of the things about what's happened with women is the silence about women. I take a preaching class, and for 2 or 3 weeks we talked about the great preachers. I got a whole list of them here. I faithfully took all my notes. Now, tell me if you've heard of these people before. Charles Simeon, a well-known, right? You ever hear of him? How about Hensley Henson? Well-known, right? How about Leslie Weatherhead? Making any connections with you? Familiar with James Alexander? And I sat in class and took notes on people I never heard of in my whole life. Alexander White. For 2,000 years worth of preachers, not one woman. I can name one right off the top of my head. Amy Semple McPherson. An evangelical woman who ran all over America and was known all over the world at the time of her preaching. Yeah, she was a little kooky, but you can't leave her out. Amy Semple McPherson. What about Ann Hutchinson, Quaker woman? You know, in New England, I heard about Cotton Mather. Well, I'd heard about him. But a whole lot of little non-entity names at little non-entity seminaries and preaching institutions. I hope my professor isn't listening to this. And at the end of that, not one woman, no mention of the black tradition, black preachers, that whole tradition that you have of great orators and preachers in the black communities. I come from the United States originally, in America. It was those preachers who held the communities together, who moved the people forward, not one mention of any of these kind of things. The silence, so that we don't have any role models. Mary Daly writes about that too. You see, you study the history of Christianity and you hear about a few great women. St. Teresa of Avila, St. Catherine of Siena, maybe St. Bridget, and hundreds and thousands. And if you look in the martyrology or you look in the saints of the church, you find that most of the women that do make it are virgins. That's the important thing about them. So-and-so, so-and-so, virgin, martyr. They really like the ones. When I was a kid growing up, there was a saint that was made when I was a kid. And this saint was held up for all of us. And the saint, I don't know if you've ever heard of this saint, was called Saint Maria Goretti. Have you heard of Saint Maria Goretti? Well, you're younger than I am. Saint Maria Goretti was made a saint back in the 50s. And she was a young Italian girl who was attacked and raped by her cousin. And she resisted his advances, and he murdered her. And while she was dying, she was stabbed to death. She prayed for forgiveness of this man, which in the Christian tradition was what she should have been doing. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And the man was conscience-struck and so on. You get this whole story surrounding Marie. But Maria Goretti was held up as a saint for women. And it's the ravished woman who resists the ravishment and prays for the ravisher. Now, in a sense, that is the model of Christianity. But why is it always a ravaged virgin who becomes the saint? Is that the essential characteristic of the Christian woman, to resist the ravisher? What about the women who worked? What about the women who didn't get ravished? Or who liked ravishing? I mean, when I read the gospel, I see a person, Jesus Christ, who is in love with living, who breaks up meetings, prayer meetings, who comes into the synagogue on the Sabbath day and sees a woman sitting over there in the women's gallery who's been bent over and crippled for 18 years, and looks over and says, "What's wrong with you?" You know, can you picture going to a service on Sunday and having someone jump up in the middle of the service when the preacher is giving this wonderful talk, this homily, and say, "Are you sick? What's wrong?" And then going over and saying, "Woman, I feel so bad," you know, and healing you right in the middle of the service. Naturally, the rabbi didn't like that at all. And if you read St. Luke's Gospel, he started an argument, right? Saying, "Wait a minute, this is the Sabbath. What are you doing?" And so on and so on. And Jesus saying, "Well, you take care of your ox and your cattle if they fall into a pit on the Sabbath. This is a daughter of Abraham. More important than your cattle." Jesus didn't wear a white nightgown and run around, you know. I mean, he was real. And he was full of life. You're sick? I don't want you to be sick. The heck with the service. I mean, you know, the heck with that wonderful speech. Jump up. Woman, what's wrong? That's the kind of model of Christendom that I see. But Mary Daly is right. Has that been the model that's been lived? And can we overcome 2,000 years of stingy living of the gospel? We're going to take a break here, but you think about that for a few minutes. Meditate on it for a second. And ask yourself, do I live a stingy life? Because it's the stingy life that's brought us the world that we're living in.
You know, I don't know how much you know about saints, but I was thinking when you were talking that certainly isn't the pattern of male saints.
No.
Au contraire, I mean, when you read about Augustine, and a lot of these guys found out that all is vanity by
Messing around.
by messing around for a long time, and then they, oh yes, now it's all vanity. In fact, Augustine left a wife and kids when he got the message and trotted off. And
She wasn't even a wife.
well, no, she was
a living.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah.
He didn't even give her that status.
Yeah. Do you want some coffee? I could run upstairs.
No,
with
I'll
you.
just have a drink of water. I'm recovering from the flu.